respected Dean and Principal Sir, esteemed faculties of various departments. Topic for today's pre-platinum Jubilee CME is bioethics. And we have two eminent speakers with us, Professor Dr. Urmila Thate Madam and Dr. Smita Patnaik. I am privileged and honored to introduce Dr. Urmila Thate Madam. She is Emeritus Professor and formerly Professor and Head Department of Clinical Pharmacology, SET GS Medical College and KEM Hospital, Mumbai. She is the Member Secretary, Forum for Ethics Review Committees in India. She serves on scientific advisory committees as a clinical pharmacology expert of the ICMR. She is in the core team that authored the 2017 edition of the ICMR Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research. She is the co-chair of the Signal Review Panel Pharmacovigilance Program of India. She serves on the National Ethics Committee of NACO and many more. Having numerous national and international publications to her credit, she has been awarded with various prestigious awards and authored and contributed chapters in many textbooks. She was the clinical pharmacology section editor for the API textbook of medicine published in the year 2008. So today we are eagerly waiting to listen from you, madam, on the topic ICMR guidelines and evolving role of IC in clinical research in India.
Shall I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. First of all, let me thank you and your dean for inviting me and having me as part of your celebrations. We just went through the 75th year of our college, so I know how important it is. And we are moving towards the 100th year now. So it's quite exciting and it's quite entertaining to be part of this whole event. Let me share my screen before I start the program.
Good afternoon, Urmila ma'am. Smita here.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. So let me start by saying that I've divided my talk into three parts. Depending on the time available, I will give all the three parts. The first part is about the evolving landscape of the ethics committees. I'll talk on that first because I thought that would be more interesting. Anybody can read the guidelines. Then second part would be about the guidelines and the third part would be about the NDCT rules because I thought that was equally important for those who were doing clinical trials. Now, India has a population of more than 1 billion and a huge disease burden. Obviously, we need to do research. If we have to do research, we need to have ethics committees. So what are these ethics committees doing? And what kind of research is going on? Some years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, we had written, Dr. Padmaja Marathe and I had written a paper, Ethics Committees in India, Past, Present and Future, in Perspectives in Clinical Research, this official journal of the Indian Society of Clinical Research. And what I thought I would do is give you a small brief based on this topic. India has really been in the forefront because we have actually done such a lot of clinical research now because we have given Covishield and Covaxin to the world. And I feel extremely proud that we have been able to do this. Not only, I mean, I know that there are deficiencies and there are shortages of vaccines in spite of having our own 2 vaccines, but we still have them. It's different from other countries who don't have their own vaccine, developing vaccine manufacturing capacities or capabilities. Compared to that, we are far, far better. Now, the story begins with with the 2005 watershed amendments in Schedule Y. When 2000 in 2005 the Schedule Y, amended Schedule Y was published, India's star rose rapidly on the clinical research horizon, and India's contribution to global clinical trials grew from 0.9% in 2008 to 5% in 2013. Against this background, it becomes important to review the status of ethics committees, which are established primarily to protect research participants' rights, dignity, and ensure his or her well-being. And we will trace the evolution of the concept of ECs in India in this paper. And we will suggest the way forward. So what I have done is we have divided the decade into three parts. The past, which covers 2005 to 2013, the present, which runs from 2013 to 15, and the future after that. Now, the first time the concept of ethics committees was introduced was in the second revision of the Declaration of Helsinki, which was adopted at the 29th World Medical Association General Assembly in Tokyo, which recommended that the design and performance of each experimental procedure should be clearly formulated in 1 minute. I will just time myself so that I don't. The design and performance of each experimental procedure involving human subjects should be clearly formulated in an experimental protocol, which should be transmitted to a specially appointed independent committee for consideration, comment, and guidance. This was the first time that anybody said we should be reviewed, that the protocol should be reviewed by any independent committee. The 1979 Belmont report further emphasized the need for review. In what happened in India, the ICMR had said in its policy statement that you need to have an ethics committee to oversee clinical research. This was a policy statement in 1980. The original version of Schedule Y, the first version, which came out in 1988, said it is desirable that protocols for clinical trials be reviewed and approved by an institutional ethics committee. We are in 1988, almost 10 years after the requirement mentioned in Declaration of Helsinki. We have a law which says it is desirable that protocols, clinical trials be reviewed by and approved by an ethics committee. And they went on to say, since such committees at present do not exist in all institutions, the approval granted to a protocol by the ethics committee of one institution is applicable to the use of a protocol in another institution, which does not have an ethics committee. They didn't say everybody should have an ethics committee. They only said that, okay, iska nahi hua to iska bhi le lo. And worse still, they went on to say that in case nobody has an ethics committee, the acceptance of the protocol by the investigator and its approval by the drugs controller or any officer authorized by him will be adequate to initiate the trials. Which means that you don't need an ethics committee. At least that is what the first Schedule Y said. But in 2001, we finally got the Indian Good Clinical Practices. In 2005, an amended Schedule Y was published, which detailed for the first time the regulatory requirement for an ethics committee. And in 2006, immediately after that, the first really detailed ethics guidelines from ICMR were published, which gave more details of how to make institute a committee. Now, what is the difference between Schedule Y and the ICMR guidelines, at least in those days? The Schedule Y said 7, ICMR said 8 to 12 people in the ethics committees. Schedule Y said to to safeguard the rights and safety and well-being of the trial subjects and particular care to protect vulnerable participants, ICMR said to review scientific and ethical soundness. There was nothing mentioned about training, although ICMR did mention you needed periodic training. And they gave in the in Schedule Y a list of documents, but in ICMR they gave it in more detail. The independent ethics committees were referred to quite favorably in both amended Schedule Y as well as ICMR guidelines. The Schedule Y said at that time that the trial sites may accept the approval granted to the protocol by the ethics committee of another trial site or approval granted by an independent ethics committee constituted according to Appendix 8, provided that the approving ethics committees are willing to accept their responsibilities for such a trial site and that the trial site is willing to accept such a response. So what we used to do in the Mumbai Independent Ethics Committee is we used to take a no objection certificate from the institution that you didn't mind if we came to your site and inspected it. ICMR guidelines also did the same thing. At that time, there was no limitation to the independent ethics committees. There were many challenges at that time to the functioning of ethics committees, and these were quite often written in a lot of papers. Lack of formally trained manpower, leading to mere scientific review. We also almost invariably did only scientific review rather than ethical review. There was a heavy workload. There was inadequate space allocated for EC operations, lack of administrative support, lack of active participation. Some of this hasn't changed. Lack of active participation by the non-medical members at the meetings and absence of standard operating procedures. There was no requirement for members to declare conflict of interest, which can compromise the functioning of the ethics committees. That led to delays in approval and therefore initiation of studies, constrained ethics committees to only initial review and approval of protocols. Continuing monitoring was often not undertaken except for a cursory review of serious adverse events. Remember, there was no requirement for the compensation, etc. Lots of arguments and fights and everything happened at that time to try to institute this. Lack of active participation in the discussions or by the non-medical members, absence of SOPs, and there was no requirement. Yeah, I said this. Let's look at some of the studies which were done at that time. A questionnaire-based study done by ICMR. 32 medical colleges and ICMR institutes participated out of 147 which were approached. And the main findings were that no legal expert was appointed to most committees. Appointment procedures were unethical, including lobbying. That means it was not the director who was appointing the committee members. Committees reviewed up to 60 projects per meeting, and minutes and record keeping was rather poor. In an editorial, Dr. Vasanta Muthuswamy, who was then the Senior Deputy Director General of ICMR, said in 2005, many IECs lack the expertise to adequately fulfill the mission of protecting research participants. In most instances, ethics approval can be regarded only as a minimal standard for research. No SOPs are there for committees which may or may not meet regularly, and they have all variable methods of evaluation and decision-making procedures. That means even variable between meetings, between the same committee, but from this meeting to the next meeting, they may vary in their way in which they reach their conclusions. So there is no standard operating procedures. They end up in doing scientific review of the research proposals and scrutinize consent form as the only proof of ethical requirement. And it was recommended that ethics review mechanisms needed drastic improvement for India to face the challenge of becoming a global hub. Remember, the industry had grown rapidly at this time, rapidly. And there was absolutely no controlling it. And the number of clinical trials had gone up from 0.9% to 5%, if you remember what I told you at the beginning of the talk. A survey of 11 ECs revealed a lack of knowledge of Schedule Y among EC members, inadequate training in GCP, inability to enlist essential documents for EC review, and failure to realize the importance role of EC approval in clinical research. This I think was very important. There's a couple of studies which showed this. A need for formal training in ethics was seen, along with the need for networking among various ethics committees. We had done a survey amongst non-technical members. And when we did that, so it revealed, when we found that several of them did not review informed consent documents. These are people who are supposed to review, and they were not reviewing informed consent documents. Those who said they did not understand the technical terms in the ICDs, and 1/3 were unaware that their presence was vital for the quorum to be met. They did not even know that they had to be there for the quorum to be met. Terrible in lack of information. There was a systematic review, not a systematic review, I think it was a scoping review, which identified 31 articles published between 2004 and 12 related to the topic of the challenges faced while establishing institutional ethics committee and functioning. And the most common challenges mentioned in these articles were inappropriate functioning, inappropriate structure, lack of oversight by regulatory bodies, and inadequate training of ethics committee members and investigators. There was another thing. There was a need for administrative and financial support, but this still remains a big challenge even today. A continued monitoring by ethics committees has been really poor, and passive monitoring is done most of the time where ethics committees review SAE reports, periodic status reports, and protocol deviations, but do not do anything else about it. Active site monitoring was not practiced at all, and EC members were never trained to do this. In KEM, we started doing this, and we did between 2008 and 9, we did some 7 site visits, and we found almost 6 out of 7 projects that we reviewed had informed consent issues, protocol deviation issues, not reporting study progress to EC, recruiting more participants without IEC approval. That means they were given permission to recruit only 60 and they would have recruited 75. What is this? We don't know why this happened. Not reporting SAEs, PI's lack of awareness of the protocol. That means the PI also didn't know what the protocol was and the ICD. Investigators and sponsors alike considered ECs as obstacles, and in turn, ECs had very inadequate teeth to do what they were supposed to do, which was to protect the research participants. And the Parliamentary Standing Committee at that time said in their report on the human papillomavirus vaccine that the EC that oversaw the HPV trials did not meet periodically to assess the progress of the project and review the SAE reports. They appeared to exist only as a formality, said the report. The committee strongly recommended that there should be a mechanism in place to take appropriate action against such dereliction of duty on part of the ECs, and the functioning of ECs should be regularly monitored. This is one thing which is still not done. They don't come and monitor us, and they do not come and inspect us. Many articles were written at that time passionately asking for reforms. Several solutions were suggested, including issues related to constitution of the EC were on top of the list of challenges. To improve the function of ECs, they needed to have SOPs and follow their SOPs, need to set up separate scientific boards, establishment of EC consortia or a state level EC, large number of papers address the need for training. An interesting recommendation that was made at that time was to have a prerequisite for the NCI recognition to have a registered ethics committee, established ethics committee. So at this time, when 2013 was a watershed again. Just like 2005 had been a watershed, 2013 was a watershed. Everything stopped in India. Clinical research stopped. Everything stopped. Ethics committees started getting frightened because they felt that responsibilities were being put on them. And most importantly, in 2019, the new drugs and clinical trial rules were published, which put together everything that was that was issued as notifications during 2013. In 2013, almost every week the DCGI was issuing a new rule. It was so difficult to keep in touch, what is the rule right now? What is the new rule that they have come up with? Every week almost they were coming up with new rules. Compensation, registration of ethics committees, name it, and it was there. And ethics committees were given far more responsibilities. That was the whole idea. Major changes that occurred in ethics in this time included requirement of registration of ECs with CDSCO or the Department of Health Research, which was mentioned in the NDCT rules. Time to approval, this was not relevant. I think I will skip this slide. What was the impact of this? The recent registration process of EC by CDSCO required submission of SOPs, including the need of a separate SOP for handling projects that study vulnerable populations. We are going to hear something about this from Smita now. We studied the SOPs of 10 medical colleges that were freely available on the internet and found that in general, all SOPs mentioned a structure and composition that was in general as mentioned as per the regulations and guidelines. But only 1 in 10 mentioned that the composition would be multidisciplinary and multisectoral. All mentioned how the EC would be constituted, always appointed by the director and principal, but none of these had these individuals as chairman, but none described the desirable qualities of each member in terms of their functions. Not one had a SOP for writing an SOP, and even more surprisingly, only some actually specified effective dates and validity dates. The recent registration process of EC by CDSCO required submission of SOPs, including the need for a separate SOP. Sorry, the same thing. The actual impact on the participants' protection is still, the jury is still out. We don't know what is the impact on the participant. How to measure it also, we don't know. We don't have a good tool to measure participant protection. The way forward, what do we do now? How do we go forward? To have in place, according to me, the one thing that we need is either have voluntary accreditation or have regulatory inspections. Now, the NABH does do voluntary accreditation. According to me, it should never be mandatory because it will be impossible to make it mandatory. It's too difficult to have. The idea of accreditation is to self-improve, to make yourself change and improve yourself. So it is a very tough process. It's not easy to be accredited. And to have accreditation is an excellent idea of your own quality. And if you have an accreditation, it means that you are reaching national or international levels of a quality, of a certain quality. But what I think we can have is routine regulatory inspections of ethics committees, because that will keep ethics committees on their toes. And if once a month at least the inspectors come, not necessarily to the same ethics committee, but to any other ethics committee, and they have a routine regulatory checkup, this would help in making sure that everybody is on their toes and they will make sure that they maintain a certain standard. The other thing is continuous monitoring. We have to make sure that we do more active monitoring. Please remember that unless you do active monitoring, you will never find out all the problems that occur after the project is started. It gets initiated, but nobody looks at what what is there and how much uh, work is being done on it. The concept of having a central EC for multi-center studies was suggested some years ago, and although US has got this idea, India has mentioned this in the ICMR guideline, the latest ICMR guideline 2017. We have mentioned a central ethics committee which can do the work for the multi-centric ethics committees. It will definitely reduce the time. I have a minute, I think, to go. I will take very little brief on the ICMR ethics guidelines. I just want to tell you the way in which it was done. It was a very hugely participatory process where the advisory committee was there and 12 subcommittees made a which was reviewed by the advisory committee and the expert committee. It was put on a public consultation in the website. Regional consultation was done and a national consultation was done. So there was a huge discussion. A lot of people participated, and it was not just the core committee that did this discussion. And we had hundreds of meetings in Bangalore. It was the pre-COVID times, so we could travel. And I don't know how many days I've spent in Bangalore in Yoli's institute. All that is new chapters have been introduced in this ICMR guidelines. I would strongly recommend you all to read these guidelines. And I want to just mention about new drugs and clinical trials law that was published on March 19th, 2019. Remember one or two things. It mentions about studies, clinical trial related injury and compensation, timelines and activities. They give you good timelines for everybody, central licensing authority as well as for ethics committees. It gives you registration of BAB centers and ethics committees. And most important, became mandatory. The NDCT rules has made it mandatory, and therefore it becomes a law in itself. This is something very important. It's about 264 pages with 13 chapters with 107 rules, 8 schedules, and 27 forms. And as I mentioned, EC registration, the ICMR guidelines are notified. There's a lot about post-trial access and composition of ethics committees. I think one thing I want you to remember is Schedule Y does not apply anymore. Do not ever refer to it now. Now it is the NDCT rules that are applicable. Renewal of registration. After your 5 years of registration, you have to renew your registration. You have to give that form of renewal 90 days prior to the date of expiry of registration. If the application is received late, then the registration shall continue, and or if it's given within these 90 days, then the registration shall continue to be passed till the order is passed. I want to thank Dr. Roli Mathur, Padmaja Marathe, Shruti Bhide, Parvan Shetty, Vasanta Muthuswamy, and all of you for listening to me. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, ma'am, for updating our knowledge on the topic with such an excellent deliberation. So at the end of the session, after the second speaker, we have the question answer session. Please be with us. Now we have our second speaker, Dr. Smita Patnaik, an SCB alumnus 1994 batch. She has done her MD and DM clinical pharmacology from PGIME at Chandigarh. She has pursued global clinical scholars research and training program from Harvard Medical School, Boston. She has also done fellowship of Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellence from Emory Clinical and Translational Research Laboratory, Atlanta. She has numerous national and international publications to her credit and has been awarded with various prestigious awards. She has contributed chapters in many textbooks. Presently, she is working as additional professor in Department of Clinical Pharmacology, PGIM at Chandigarh. So today she will speak on research in vulnerable population. So over to you, Dr. Smita. Dr. Smita.
You have to unmute me. Hello? Dr. Preeti, you have to unmute me.
Okay, okay.
You are unmuted, madam.
You are unmuted.
But I am not able to share my screen. It is saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
The previous
you
speaker
have to
have to
be
unmute.
co-host. Yeah, you have to be co-host.
Okay, I think now I should be able to share my screen. Hello?
Yes,
Am I
ma'am.
audible?
Devashish co-host karo. Co-host karo.
Yes, yes.
Try cheyandi, sir.
You are audible, Smita. Now please share your slides.
I'm somehow not unable, I mean not able to.
I think the fast speaker has to leave the meeting.
He has left, madam.
Yes, yes, on
What you have
screen,
to
on
do?
screen.
Yeah,
Ask
you
that
have
on
to
screen.
open the slide in the desktop, then go to share screen, select, and then make it a
That I
slideshow.
did. Somehow it is not allowing me to share my screen.
I think
You,
Smita
you,
joined.
you leave it. Yeah, you leave and rejoin, ma'am. You leave and rejoin.
Mm.
Just a minute. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me join as one of my, I am here with my slides. So let me join from here.
Yeah, you can join from another laptop, but that identity has to be a co-host.
Okay, so kindly make Sumit Dey as a co-host. Because
Devashish,
Yes, sir.
Sumit De.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Not yet joined.
there is some issue that I'm not able to figure out.
Madam, just leave the meeting and rejoin. Everything will be regularized.
Okay, okay, okay. Let me try that.
देवाशीष co-host करदेव मैडम
हम जॉइन करना देखो
आउ थे जॉइन कले co-host करदेव
Dr. Smita, now you are visible.
Please unmute, ma'am.
Please unmute.
Okay, am I audible, madam?
Yes, yes. Now you are audible.
Okay. Okay, so
Please share
am
your
I
slides.
allowed to share my screen?
Yes.
No, it is showing that host has disabled participant screen sharing.
देवाशीष you have made her a co-host
You are a co. Okay, now let me try one more time. Okay, now I think I'll be able to share. Yes. Is my screen
no
visible?
ma'am not yet
Okay.
Yes, it's coming.
yes it has come
Yes, yes.
yeah it has
Now
come
Now it is in.
I am so sorry for all this trouble. Okay, so can I start now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So good afternoon, Jan sir. Good afternoon, Preeti madam, and everybody else. I think Urmila madam has just left.
I haven't left, Smita. I'm here still.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am. I also wished you in the beginning, but somehow there's too many participants. So okay. So shall I start, ma'am? Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
So this is how, as Preeti ma'am introduced, I just start with some of my memories as an alumni. So this is me. This is the naive person who joined in 2090. I mean, back in 1994, and I completed my MBBS in 2000. So these are my buddies. We were only 20 girls in our batch, and we had this. I had beautiful memories of SCB, and so all the fun days, these were picnics, and we thoroughly enjoyed those moments. I wish I could relive them again. And so there we go. In 2000, when I graduated, it was our house staff function. By this time, we were all a little more wise, or we were still like trying to look for our destinies, where it is going to pull us to. And at that time, we were a little more confident. So I was the Miss Murgi of our batch. And this was the house staff function. And it feels really great to be invited as an alumni for the pharmacology department pre-platinum jubilee CME, and it is again a proud privilege to be a co-speaker with Urmila ma'am, whom I look up to as one of my mentors. You can say she is a frequent visitor to our department. We learned a lot from her during our MD days and DM days. And this is how, after 25 years, we got together in December 2019. And that's the journey so far for me. This is how we grew up in last 25 years. So coming back to my topic, so I'll try to, in the wake of time, basically we have lost some minutes in the technical issues. So I would try to be as crisp as possible. So looking at the topic that was assigned to me, I'll just touch upon a brief of history, and then I will tell about the concept of vulnerability in clinical research and context sensitive vulnerability. What is it and what does it mean? Then how should we protect our vulnerable participants, and whose responsibility is this? Essentially, that I'll just be very brief on the topic. And how do we protect these vulnerable subjects? And what is the role of the IEC? Ma'am has already enumerated the role of IEC in pretty much elaborately. So I'll just be as brief and as quick as possible. So why are we worried about these vulnerable subjects? So right in the beginning, we that the clinical the actually wanted meat and want people to eat a vegetarian food. And this is the earliest, though we know the clinical trials, the trial that we think in the 18th century, but the vulnerability of the subjects who is participating in a clinical trial actually typically comes from these Nazi experiments, which were pretty much inhumane and in the 1930s. And then the famous or the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, where participants were actually deprived of the penicillin, which is the cure for syphilis. And there were, again, the subjects who were elderly and institutionalized, and they were injected with the liver cancer cells. And the mentally challenged children who were injected with the hepatitis A virus to study again the natural course of the disease. So all these actually led to the regulations that came, which was meant to protect the vulnerable subject. One is the Nuremberg Code, the other one is the Belmont Code, and the Declaration of Helsinki. So at present, what we follow is our Declaration of Helsinki, which is universally followed. But for us in India, we take the ICMR guidelines as benchmark, and which essentially follows all the international guidelines to the context in India. So what do we understand by vulnerability? So it comes from a Latin word which is called wound, to wound. So that means these individuals are not able to protect themselves as research subject because their autonomy is compromised. Their voluntariness to provide an informed consent is, maybe it could be kind of influenced by coercion or force or power or like. So this is how it has been defined. I'll just skip that in the time. So what makes the subject vulnerable? It could be factors within the subject or it could be factors outside the subject. So lack of decision-making ability and not able to comprehend, or there is disability, mental disability or physical disability, where the person is not, in a desperate situation and is not able to make any judgment whether or not he should participate. or it could be factors outside of the subject, which is poor access to healthcare facility, or there is social injustice, racial disparities, social stigma associated with some diseases, and likewise. So essentially, these people are at the risk of exploitation. That is why they are called vulnerable. So who are considered vulnerable participants? So it could, these are, I will not go through the list, and that's for the students to note down. I'll share the slides, and believe me, everything is there in the ICMR guidelines, so nothing is actually new. All I want to do is to put things in perspective. So what is the matter of concern here? So we want to prevent the additional harm that is arising due to participation in research. Many a times this could be any type of harm. It could be physical harm, bodily harm. It is the harm to the self-respect or dignity of the person, or an assault to their rights. So there are some misconceptions associated with the vulnerability or the vulnerable subjects. What are these? The misconception is that we need not do research on the vulnerable participant, which is not a true thing, because many a times when we don't have data on these subjects, like children, like pregnant women, or like women of childbearing age group. So many a times it has been seen that we have no data on these patients for usage of a particular drug. And since these drugs act on the other population, we keep on doing a hit and trial on this population by modifying the dose without any evidence. So these population are essentially then called the therapeutic orphans. So the misconception has to go that the vulnerable population should not be included in research. Rather, the message is we have to empower the vulnerable population so as to ensure a proper informed consent process and make their participation in research safe and with dignity, and their harm is minimized like we consider it for the other population. And the next thing is, it is not a categorical variable. See, we don't, when we enter the data in the Excel and analyze, we don't say it is a vulnerable population or not a vulnerable population. So in statistical term, I would say it is not a categorical variable, and it is not an all or none phenomena. So it is rather very much situational. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a woman in the clinical trial research subject, and you are giving cash for payment. For a disadvantaged woman with 2 children and no one to support, this would be a benefit like 1,000 rupees for spending 2 hours in a clinic. However, for a CEO who's acting in who's placed, I mean, both are women, but we can't say that the CEO is actually obliged to take that 1,000 rupees for earning. However, coercion and monetary benefit might attract the first lady to participate in research. So therefore, I put it into the terms called contextual vulnerability. So the contextual vulnerability is important, and these are the 6 factors. The whole vulnerable population we can actually divide into these 6 categories. So I'm not going into the detail. So I have already explained some of the things, so that the people who are institutionalized are also vulnerable. People who are terminally ill or in an emergency department waiting for treatment are also medically vulnerable. In the COVID-19 situation, when we had patients who are having respiratory failures, and we have been desperately trying for one drug or the other. So these are medically vulnerable population. Okay, so key principles of protecting the vulnerable. So ICMR, actually, these are there in the ICMR guidelines. It gives you 6 principles. Ma'am mentioned already some of them. So ICMR 2017 guideline is a must go for all the IEC and all the students, all the people who are actually interested in doing research on the human subjects. So these are the 6 key principles. And now coming to the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? So the stakeholders are essentially 3: the researcher, the IEC, and the sponsor. So when I say these 3, I say that they are, the ICMR also says that all three are kind of interrelated. However, to my mind, the IEC is the very strong and powerful body which actually does the oversee. Ma'am has already mentioned all the role of the IEC and how it can help in protecting the vulnerable subjects is also mentioned in this ICMR document, which is the ICMR and the National Institute of Reproductive Health has given some directive, and this is available online. I have shared the link for this in the references. Now, the ICMR guideline says duties or obligations of the researchers. Now, somehow for personal reasons, I don't like this term obligation. So obligation sounds like has a negative connotation to it. So I would say duties and responsibility of the researchers. Though the IEC does the whole work of overseeing and also taking it forward as a research project, it is the day in, day out duty of the researcher to protect the vulnerable. And this is important in the context, like the researcher is the person who actually comes in contact with the subjects, and then he or she is the one who actually understand the ground level realities. When we say economically disadvantaged or any other thing, the thing which is not written between the, I mean, this the which is not written there, what is there for the protection is also equally shared with the researchers. Now, this is the IEC workflow. This document is also available. And one thing that I would like to emphasize here is the full committee of the IEC should do the initial and the continuing review of such proposals and to have empowered representatives from this specific population during such deliberations. So next, I would like to share a copy of an SOP. Maybe you will find it familiar, but just to show that how the IEC can actually have how handle the protocols or to review the population. Okay, so the three key questions, these are also important. And one thing that is ensured is voluntariness of the informed consent. And this has to be. Now, this is another example I wanted to give, that is the anticipated direct benefit to the subject in case of a cognitively impaired adult. So this is a document again available online, and one of the IEC SOPs, how to review the vulnerable population protocols. Okay, I'll just skip through this. So sponsor also, the main thing for the sponsor is he has to maintain the quality control and quality assurance processes and kind of enforce them to help protecting the vulnerable. Okay. Now, without going too much into detail, so women are traditionally being considered as vulnerable population, but it should also be ensured that they should not be arbitrarily excluded from research, because again, the issue of therapeutic orphan will crop up. Like an example of aspirin I can give, when it was promoted for the, when they saw the benefit in the secondary prevention of the patients who were having history of elderly women, and it was found that the hemorrhagic stroke was more in the elderly women compared to the other population. So therefore, the popularity of aspirin in the elderly women actually reduced, and it was actually evidence-based because women were included in that research. So such kind of data will not ever be generated if we exclude this population. However, I would draw your attention to a complex scenario like when a reproductive age group women actually becomes pregnant during the course of the study. And it is but natural that she would be excluded. But what to do with this individual? Whether we have explained her adequately the risk of participating in the research, and also explained her enough that if there are congenital malformations or abnormalities detected, how it is going to be dealt with. So these are some of the scenarios where the IEC actually plays a lot of role, and also does the conflict resolution as well as looks up the whole thing. So that the participant is the harm which has been created, and how the participant and the researcher, everyone is bailed out of this situation. Okay, so now a few words about the children. So children basically are, we already know that they should be exclusive research subject when these diseases are typically of that age group. And there is some PKPD data available, and there are age appropriate formulations and other things are administration methods are feasible. So here the main thing that we are interested to know is whether there is a legally acceptable representative or legally authorized representative is available to give the valid consent, because they are legally not cannot provide a valid consent before 18 years. So the ICMR document says that documented assent is needed for 12 to 18 years, and for 7 to 12 years a verbal assent is needed, and up till 7 years documented, of course, provide the. So that's where I will stop. The ICMR guidelines also give a lot of other details, which for the in the interest of time I did not include. And these are some of the references for further reading. And thank you everyone for your kind attention. This is how I want to end. Mahatma Gandhi said that the true measure of any society be found that how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Smita, for such an excellent presentation. Now is the question answer session. We have one question in the chat box from Professor Dr. Jayant Kumar Panda. His question is, by meaning IEC should look into the ethical issues, but practically we have to cover academic and technicality of submitted papers also. How should we go about?
I think this question is meant for ma'am.
Yes.
What is the question? I'm sorry, I missed it. What did you, can you repeat it?
Question is, by meaning IEC should look into the ethical issues, but practically we have to cover academic and technicality of submitted papers also. How should we go about? This question is asked
by whom? Asked by whom?
Asked by Professor Dr. Jayant Kumar Panda.
Okay, let me sorry for the interruption. I don't think this is a question which needs to be answered. I can make a observation on this. You know, we have an institutional research review committee for the technical aspect, the research review committee who are technical aspect, to look into the technical aspect they look into. But as regard the ethical issue, I don't think ethics committee should look into the technical aspect. They can point out if there are, they have the privilege of pointing out, but basically they should look to the ethical aspect, whether there is ethical issues in the proposal submitted. Madam, Urmila Madam.
Yeah, so yes, indeed, of course, the ethical issues need to be looked at, but I disagree that the scientific aspects should not be looked at. You need the ethics, I mean, the ethics committee's responsibility is to look at the science also, because bad science is bad ethics. So it is very important that the science is also looked at and we identify any major scientific glitch that is there in the ethics, in the proposal. That also needs to be looked at and addressed by the investigator, especially in thesis, etc.
What we have formulated in our institution, madam, we have got 3 levels as regard the technical aspects are concerned. We have got a departmental research committee where the HOD and 1 or 2 faculties are member of the departmental research committee. They will scrutinize a proposal. They will submit to the institutional research committee, which is 4-member committee, which will look into the technical aspect. It will not look into the ethical aspect. Then after it is through from the IRC, Institutional Research Committee, then only it is forwarded to the Institutional Ethics Committee. So beforehand it goes to Ethics Committee, the technical part has already been looked after. That is what we have been doing.
Yeah, so if you all are happy with that, then that is fine. But according to me, the science part of it has to be looked at by the ethics committee, because the ethics committee's responsibility is to protect the participant. So bad science is bad ethics. So it is sadly, it falls on the ethics committee to look at. So if they find any major glitch, they have to bring it to the notice.
That is correct.
They don't need to look at it in so much detail if the science committees are good. The problem is when the science committees are not good and they don't do their job. If they are only rubber stamping their approvals, then we are in trouble.
This question crept in because Professor Panda is one of the members of the ethics committee of our institution. And we did not have an institutional research committee. So a lot of time was spent looking into the technical aspect of the paper.
Yeah.
But ethics was not getting the due time at that.
The problem with most committees, they look at science only and they forget the ethics.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with Urmila ma'am, because bad science is bad ethics. There had been a beautiful paper in JAMA in 1991, and the 10 points. First point is you should have a scientifically valid question to be asked in this research, and which is being tried to answer. So bad science is definitely bad ethics.
No, I do not have any disagreement on that. But what I am telling, there is multiple level of scrutiny. So when there is multiple level of scrutiny, chances of having a bad science, including the IEC, there is a final level of scrutiny. So if there are multiple level of scrutiny, chances of having a bad science is usually avoided. That is what I am trying to after the scrutiny.
I agree. You have a double layered protection with the science, with the department review board as well as the institutional review board. So that's great, provided they are doing their work. If they're not doing their work, the problem comes when if the ethics committee finds some problem, then they have to raise it. That's all.
This second question, madam, from my side. Should we leave everything to the institutional ethics committee, or we should at least have a institutional research committee to guide on technicalities?
Institutional research committee that's very good, especially for thesis, etc. I'll tell you why that improves the quality, because they will have more subject experts. And to my mind, the departmental review boards should do their work, because the departmental review boards are the actual subject experts. They are their own subject experts, from their own departments. So they should do their work properly. If they all did their work properly, then there would be less work for the ethics committee as well.
Agreed. So in between the IRC, the Institutional Research Committee, which looks to the methodology of research, that is not exactly the job of the institutional, not the full job of the Institutional Ethics Committee. So there is a guidance by the Institutional Research Committee to look to the methodology, whether the correct methodology has been applied or not. Anyway, next question.
The next question in the chat box is from Professor Dr. Geeta Sahu, HOD FMT. Should our college have DSIR certificate for extramural projects, and is it mandatory for our institutional ethics committee be registered under DHR?
Yes, it is mandatory by law to be registered under DHR. All committees have to be registered under DHR. NDCT rules, that's why I told you about the NDCT rules. And it is mandatory by law to be registered under DHR. CIDESCO is not mandatory because CIDESCO is for only those who are doing clinical trials, you know, for new drugs, etc. But for DHR, it's mandatory for all ethics committees to be registered. So it is mandatory for you to be registered. The CSIR, what was the other question she asked?
ESIR certificate, ma'am.
CSIR certificate.
No, ma'am. She has written, should our college have DSIR certificate for extramural projects? And
No, that is your it's not mandatory. You can do it if you want to. It's useful for saving some money, etc. I think you can save money. You can.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, if you have the DSIR certificate, then you get some duty exemption in the importing the instruments that are coming from abroad. So many of the funding agencies actually ask for this DSIR certificate because they have to otherwise factor in the extra amount of import duty.
Smita, can I add a point? I'm
Sure, ma'am.
super from Calcutta. The DSIS certificate also gives you tax exemptions. It is for example, if you're procuring it solely for the purpose of research, you only get financial benefits. GST becomes 5%. So it has got nothing to do with research. It is only for an institution to get some financial benefits for procurements of goods and equipment for research.
Yeah, it's
Yes,
about
and
the money. It's not, so there's no
Yeah.
mandatoriness in that.
But then, ma'am, when you have a
You become muted.
no.
yes, now you are audible.
Okay, so in the due diligence process, the actually funding agency asked for the DSIR certificate because, as Dr. Suparna mentioned, the GST is also less for other kits you buy or the chemicals we buy. That is why people opt for DSIR certificate. And I would think that SCB should also have should apply for the DSIR certificate. And since they are conducting research also, it would be beneficial.
Well, we have a multidisciplinary research unit as well, MRU. Now, this is helping us to boost up the research projects and encouraging the faculty and student alike to be more research oriented. And as regard the funding is concerned, that fund that is granted by DHR, MRU is a offshoot of DHR only. So there where I don't think that is as such exempted as regard the MRUs are concerned. So whatever we procure instrument equipments, I think we get the tax exemption, but DSIR certificate for institution is required. That we will look for. And what Madam was telling about the other registration, IEC mandatory registration, we have it right from the day one. IEC registration, DHR registration is mandatory by Government of India. But the other one that is required, which is Bangalore based, I'm not able to remember the name. Whatever I think is the agency which registered that is not mandatory. There is another one that is there, which asks for registration from Bangalore. We have not been doing it. Is it required to have another registration?
No, it's only DHR Delhi you have registration, mandatory. Mandatory is only the DHR, Department of Health Research.
Yeah, I know. Before we go to that, I think I would like to ask Smita, the Murgi of the year that you were selected on that day. You presented yourself, we never knew it. I have few requests to you. Since you are alumnus of this institution, the beautiful photographs of those, it was not silver jubilee of your years. Give some photograph. Preeti will give my mobile number. Please bring some old photograph that you have fondly preserved as memory. We are going to find out a coffee table book. So we are going to incorporate beautiful photograph those olden days because we are not finding much of photographs. So please remember to send it to Preeti.
photographer, sir.
Particularly
I
that
will.
photograph what you had shown. Miss Murgi.
At that time, we had really, after 5 years, we had dropped those inhibitions.
Good. Acha, any other questions?
Yes, sir. There is another question from Dr. Ashok Swai. He is a pharmacologist. For multicentric trials, the EC opinion of different IECs may differ. Ethical reviews should be rather more uniform. What is your opinion on having a single EC at the national or state or zonal level instead of so IECs?
So I agree with that, and I have actually mentioned it also in my talk, that the ICMR guideline, the 2017 guideline, is talking about a single review ethics committee for multicentric studies, especially those which have got low risks. Now, the only problem with that is if you can't have zonal and state or national ethics committees, because then if they don't meet, then you'll never get your approvals. And it'll take forever, if it is, for example, you're living in one part of the state and that committee is in a different part of the state, then it is very difficult to get approvals. If you can't go, you can't go to that committee office and talk to those people. The second problem is about the consent forms. There are local issues which nobody else will know other than the ethics committee of the local institution, which you cannot address if you are in the state or you don't know the issues in that hospital. What are the local issues? So you need to have a local ethics committee as well to look at the local informed consent issues. So you will have to have both the committees, and you can have, but the issue about having the central ethics committee or a main ethics committee, as we've called it in the ICMR guidelines, is that the main ethics committee will be able to reduce your timeline. You will get approval for the project, because that main ethics committee, once it approves it, then all the centers that are doing the study can take it as approved. And your application also doesn't have to have different forms and different types of applications. And, a lot of your administrative work also reduces. So from
I think, yeah, that's correct. Perfect. Just sorry for the interruption. Preeti, I have got, this is such a nice forum. We are able to know many things. I have some queries from my side also to Professor Urmila Thate and to Dr. Smita Patnaik, both of you. When we talk about research, MCI has given a guideline about research to introduce the research in the mind of the postgraduate student. Now, every institution has so huge number of PG students, and all of us realize that we have 250 students every year passing out, maybe 260 or 70 if you put DMMCH. So, to have original research work for 270 in one institution, how far we are justified as regard the IEC is concerned. And we know that most of the projects are mostly copy paste, most of them. So what is the guidance you both of would like to give here?
I think some effort by the guide is important. The guide has to have some responsibility and has to think of original ideas. And if they are not having original ideas, they should not become guides. Because after all, it's their responsibilities. And if they don't have any ideas at all, any research ideas, then don't become guides. Then don't do unnecessary work. See, people become guides only just so that you can have a gadha to do the gadha majuri, to have a student so that all the work gets done in the ward. But you can't do only that. You have to also think of the other things, like what MCI has insisted in terms of having a responsibility of doing good research. And I think, according to me, you shouldn't become a guide if you don't have some idea.
Realistically not possible, madam. That's what I was trying to know your viewpoint. Yes, Dr. Smita.
Yeah, sir, I think this is a universal phenomena. I mean, we all struggle from the same. the students duration, the tenure is so short that you cannot, even if you have a good idea, he cannot complete the number of samples or the sample size that is required for the study. So one thing that we devised some time back was to plan a good study and keep giving the same study to the subsequent students. Only the guide has to certify that, okay, this student has enrolled, let's say out of 300, he has enrolled 70 patients in this study. And that should, because when we say that
There is some audio problem at your end. Anyway, please go ahead.
so in that case, the guide should be able to certify, okay, the person has recruited so many patients. So therefore, you can have multiple students continuing on the same project. And at the end, when the guide, because the guide is a permanent member, so the guide can compile and this is the main problem. Students do not remain interested after they pass out. This definitely is a universal phenomenon.
It is really a privilege. I have got one more doubt, since I think you talked about the vulnerable population. Now, drug trial and the vulnerable population. You know, multinational company, they are coming up with their trial. They are utilizing our patient population for their gain. What should be the yardstick? What should be the approach?
So this is actually a contentious issue, and you will find n number of newspaper articles saying that Indians.
I think there is some problem with your audio. Because this is a very interesting thing. I would like to take the viewpoint of both of you.
So is it better, sir?
Okay.
So, it is definitely a contentious issue where the multinational, the Indian patients or Indian population is being
Exploited.
treated as a guinea pig
Exploited.
by the multinational. So
Yeah.
here comes the role of the ethics committee, sir. When, let us say, for a participant in the US in the same multinational company, he has been paid $3,000 and he has been paid, let's say, 3,000 rupees in India. There is a huge difference.
But that is, what I am trying to point out to both of you. It is not an original research work of an institution.
Yes, but the multinational companies are usually coming for generating their data.
Yeah, that's all. They want to
Indian
collect the data by exploiting the patient population. Are they not vulnerable?
No,
They are-
it's not necessarily exploitation, because our patients also require those new medicines. Our
Correct.
patients also require exposure to those new medicines, especially in oncology. They need that exposure. So those patients need these new drugs. So it is important that they participate in the clinical trials, because they have reached the end of their ability to take any medicines. There are no medicines available. So for them, doing this trial is a way to try to save their lives. So they deserve that chance.
As regard oncology is concerned, madam, it is very understandable. But beyond oncology, there are a huge number of trials going on by multinational, particularly when I say about insulin. They do not get subjects or the population in developed country. They are coming to the developing country to utilize their research. That is what I
no,
have-
sir.
Yeah,
No,
please.
sir. We cannot. I mean, there is no black and white about it. So, I mean to say, as ma'am mentioned, that our population also needs to be a beneficiary of those new medications. And our law also says that at least 300 patients from India should show benefit on the such a specific drug so that it can be marketed in India. So therefore it
300.
is
300.
So,
Yeah.
exactly. So if our population is already in the is the part of those national multinational.
We've lost you. Can't hear you, Smita.
Preeti, I think if we can conclude now onward. We is already 5:25.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, I think let her complete. After completion of Smita and also Madam Urmila Madams.
Am I better audible,
Yeah,
sir?
yeah,
Now?
yeah.
Okay. So, sir, there is no gray, I mean, there is no black and white in this. So, the main role is of the ethics committee to ensure that these trials are being conducted in a fair way and the ethics and the subject vulnerability, etc., are being taken care of.
The
There's
only
no
point
harm
is
in
the
conducting
only
these trials.
point is that the ethics committee should also look into the commerce involved in it. That is what I was trying to point
Yes, sir.
out.
That is the conflict of
Exactly.
interest.
Yes.
That's the conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest. That is true. So ethics committee also should look into the commerce or the trade involved in that. Anyway, madam, your final view before we conclude.
No, I agree with her. When I repeat that ethics committees could please, Mukund. When I say that we need to have ethics committee plays a very central role in this, that they should ensure that it is done ethically, the trial is done ethically, and that's why we need local ethics committee to be able to ensure that they're part of. Because I'll tell you one thing, that although Smita enlisted vulnerability, everybody becomes vulnerable in our population. If you look at the population that we have, they're also poor or uneducated, illiterate, maybe sometimes. They may not be illiterate, they are uneducated. About clinical research, they are certainly uneducated and they don't have any clue about their rights. And I think, therefore, it behoves on the ethics committee as well as on the investigators to ensure that they are not taken advantage. So
Thank you, madam. I think that is really a good thing. I am very unaware of many things. I thought I'll try to learn a few more things from both of you.
There are two people
Before-
who have their hands up. I can see Saurin and Dr.
Yeah, please make it quick. In fact, I came in because of my curiosity and took some time. Yeah, Preeti.
Yeah, Dr. Saurin Das.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening,
Good evening,
sir.
sir. Good
ma'am.
evening.
Just to give you an input, I have spent more than 25 years doing global research. And one thing which is very particular, which Madam Thate and Smita both have pointed out, not only the ethics committee, I would also suggest that the principal investigator also plays a key role in these sponsored clinical trials. And I agree that the cost difference is there, but the cost difference is not so huge today between India and the global sponsors or the global clinical trial sites. So if all of us ensure that we do the right thing in terms of the clinical practice and following the guidelines to the T, I'm sure that none of the Indian patients will be either quote unquote victimized or utilized for just the data. Because any trial or any drug that we are using today as clinicians have gone through the rigorous route of clinical trials all over the world. Let's not go by a few examples which have set bad examples for the country or for the drug industry or the medical fraternity. Let's look at all the good things that have happened in clinical research and global clinical trials or Indian clinical trials, because data is ultimately the power and the knowledge that is giving us the freedom to give the best treatment to our patients. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Another person, Dr. Ashok Swai, also raised hand.
Let
Thank you,
it be
ma'am.
the last question. It is going to be 5:30.
Yes, sir. I'll just take a minute because most of the things have been already covered by.
We would
Thate
like to
madam.
know your viewpoint, sir. Definitely, your observation is welcome always.
Thank you, sir. So, Professor Thate has already clarified certain points that it is not exploitation, rather, and same thing Dr. Smita also mentioned that, instead of avoiding this vulnerable population, we should expose them to the trial under certain, standard conditions, under more supervision, more strict supervision, so that we get appropriate data. In fact, in Europe, you might be aware, pediatric investigation plan is a mandatory thing unless you ask for a waiver for the same, right? So this should be exposed to, the drug under a controlled manner, under the guidance. And already I posted a message, I probably will be closing soon. If everybody does their job properly, I'm pretty sure, not pretty sure, I'm very much sure that, this exploitation thought also even will not come to a mind. We'll be able to give them the right opportunity to participate in the trial, the benefits, what goes to the patient. At the same time, what Dr. Sorinda said, that also will be possible. We'll be able to generate data while taking care and the safety of the patients.
Thank you, sir.
So,
Thank you so much.
one more point here, just last one. I think it is more that, it's high time that we should look for industry and academia collaboration, which is happening. In fact, I know with KEM, probably that would be the best example that I know, because I have been in Mumbai, I have not been in Delhi. That same thing I would expect from my college, from SCB, and I also did my MD from Burla. It will be good to work with them. So the industry and academia collaboration, that is what I will look forward to in future. Thank you.
When did you pass out from SCB?
95, sir.
95.
Yeah.
So you are pretty junior to us. That is how I can
Yeah.
make out. Okay, anyway, but you are welcome for the SCB and Global Conclave and Platinum Jubilee, your own alma mater.
Yes.
That is what I would like to extend my welcome from here.
Thank you, sir.
Now, anything else, Preeti?
Now I request Dr. Suhasini Devuri to offer the vote of thanks.
First of all, before this, she formally offers the vote of thanks. I'm really, from the institution at Hadri Institution, I'm personally thankful to both the speakers and the participant for their contribution. Thank you so much, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I was so scared that I just run through my slide so that you don't get irked that I overshot my time.
Now, let me tell you briefly. For the last 3-4 days, this is an academic jubilation we are having. The pre-platinum CME, it is academic extravaganza jubilation we are having. For last 3-4 days, it has exceeded 6 p.m. also. So there was some resentment among the participants. So that is the reason I thought, let me try to curtail at 5:30. Bear with me, excuse me for intervening.
Oh, no problem. Cut short, and I can share my slides for the students.
And definitely the one that I have mentioned.
Good evening, one and all present here. On this wonderful evening, I would like to present vote of thanks on behalf of Department of Pharmacology. We take the golden opportunity to thank our Dean and Principal Sir, Professor Dr. Datteswar Hota, for giving us a great platform to conduct pre-platinum Jubilee CME. We extend our thank you, sir. We extend our gratitude to esteemed members of core committee for Platinum Jubilee for providing us necessary requisites. We are extremely thankful to our speakers, Professor Dr. Urmila Thakte Madam and Dr. Smita Patnaik, for their nice deliberation and clarifying various queries of the participants. Thank you, Madam. It is our great pleasure to thank our senior professors, Dr. Sabita Mahapatra, Dr. Truptirekha Swai, and also other members like Dr. Suparna Chatterjee, Dr. Vandana Ratha, Dr. Soren Das for joining us in spite of their busy schedule and spending their valuable time to encouraging us. We sincerely thank to all the attendees and participants of the CME for their presence and making this glorious event to a great success. Thank you all. Last but not the least, we thank to Mr. Devasis for his technical support. Thank you.
Suhasini, the last statement should be welcoming them to our Platinum Jubilee.
So on behalf of the institution, on behalf of Dean and Principal, I welcome our speakers and all the participants from the outside and inside of the state to our Silver Jubilee celebration.
Not Silver Jubilee, Platinum Jubilee.
Platinum Jubilee celebration.
Okay, thank you. Nice time we had. Very, lot of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam.
Urmila ma'am, namaste.